The last thing my father ever said to my sister and me was, "Never let money make you forget your family." At the time, we promised him it never would. Less than 24 hours later, I broke that promise. Or at least, that's what my sister came to believe. Looking back now, I understand why. But in that moment, I didn't even understand it myself. My father spent his life living by those words, long before he ever needed to speak them out loud from a hospital bed. He believed money came and went. Houses could be rebuilt, businesses could fail, but trust, once it disappeared, rarely found its way back. For 40 years he lived like that mattered more than anything else. Friends admired him. Employees respected him. Neighbors trusted him with their homes, their problems, sometimes even their children. To everyone on the outside, Thomas Whitmore was the kind of father people wished they'd had. That's exactly why nobody, not even his own daughters, ever thought to question the quiet life he lived. I certainly never did. Not until less than an hour after we buried him, when a single sentence in his own handwriting undid everything I thought I knew about the man I loved most in this world. By sunset that same day, my younger sister was convinced I had lied to her for years. By the next morning, she had blocked my number, taken down every photo of us in her house, and started telling people she didn't have a sister anymore. I want to tell you now that the truth wasn't really about an inheritance. It wasn't even entirely about my father's secret. It was about a mystery so convincing that it made both of us doubt every memory we'd ever shared. And by the time we finally understood what had really happened, I realized the secret my father spent his whole life protecting had never been about another family at all. It had been about me. If you're watching this, let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from. And if stories like mine keep you up thinking, hit subscribe, because I promise you, this one isn't finished. I remember the funeral ending just after 3 o'clock, on a cold Thursday afternoon in Hartford. Rain came down steady and gray, the kind that makes everyone move a little faster toward their cars, offer one last quiet nod, and go back to their own lives. My sister Evelyn and I stayed behind. We stood beside the grave long after everyone else had gone. I had one hand on the umbrella, my other hand held hers. I could feel her fingers trembling, and I remember thinking that whatever came next, we would get through it together, the way we always had. We'd survived losing our mother years earlier. We'd sat through every round of my father's chemotherapy side by side, taking turns reading to him when he was too tired to hold a book himself. The nurses used to comment on how close we were, how rare it was to see two sisters that devoted to the same parent. Standing there in the rain, I had no idea that within a few hours, we would both start questioning whether we had ever really known the man we'd just put in the ground. Waiting by the cemetery gate was Richard Lawson, my father's attorney for over 30 years. Richard wasn't just the man who handled legal paperwork. He'd watched Evelyn and me grow up. He'd been at our graduations, our holidays, more family dinners than I could count. That afternoon, something about him looked different. He waited until every other car had pulled away before he came over, an old leather briefcase pressed tight under his arm. His face held the same grief everyone else's did, but there was something else underneath it. I recognized it later as hesitation, though at the time, I only knew that something felt wrong. He told us, quietly, that our father had left instructions requiring both of us to hear his final wishes together, in the same room, at the same time. Neither of us was allowed to hear it alone. I remember thinking that was just my father being careful, the way he'd always been. I had no idea how much that one instruction would end up mattering. 20 minutes later, we were sitting in Richard's office, looking out over downtown Hartford through rain-streaked windows. He set a thick, sealed envelope down on the table between us, and looked at both of us in a way I had never seen him look at anyone before. He apologized before he even opened it. He said our father had made him promise not to answer any questions until every page had been read exactly as written. I told myself it was just my father's usual precision. He never left anything to chance. Evelyn even smiled a little, guessing he was probably just trying to keep us from fighting over furniture. Richard didn't smile back. He broke the seal, and the room went so quiet that the sound of rain on the glass felt louder than his voice. My father's letter started with words neither of us expected. He wrote that everything we were about to hear had a purpose, even if it didn't feel like it at first. He asked us to remember that love sometimes asks us to make decisions that don't make sense in the moment. Then Richard kept reading. Our father left the house, the construction company, every account he had, nearly everything, to me. Evelyn inherited none of it. Instead, he left her a single brass key to a safety deposit box, box 317, at Hartford National Bank. I watched my sister's face as Richard set that small key down on the table. I watched her try to make sense of it, the same way I was trying to make sense of it myself, though for a very different reason. Our father had written that I must never stop Evelyn from opening that box, and that Evelyn must never judge me before she'd read everything inside it. I remember the exact second my stomach dropped, and it had nothing to do with confusion. It had everything to do with a secret I had buried so deep, for so long, that I had almost convinced myself it wasn't real anymore. I didn't know yet what was in that box, but some part of me, some quiet, terrified part I hadn't let myself listen to in 30 years, already suspected it had my name on it. Then Richard read the sentence that changed the temperature of the entire room. For almost 30 years, our father admitted, he had been secretly supporting another family. Neither of us said a word. Neither of us moved. I stared at that letter the same way Evelyn did, both of us certain we'd somehow misread it. I want to be honest with you now, the way I couldn't be honest with my sister that day. I wasn't shocked for the reason she thought I was. I was terrified, because I thought I finally understood what that sentence meant, and I was wrong about almost all of it. I just didn't know that yet. My father's confession sat in that room like something none of us could lift. Richard folded the letter and set it down, but the silence that followed was louder than anything he could have said. I kept staring at that page, searching for some detail that would make it all make sense. I'd spent the last 6 months of my father's life driving him to chemo appointments, managing his medications, sitting up with him on the nights he couldn't sleep. If he'd really been supporting another family for 30 years, how had I missed it? I know now that my sister was somewhere else entirely in her own mind. She wasn't trying to understand our father anymore. She was trying to understand why I had inherited everything, and she had been handed nothing but a key and a confession. I didn't fully understand it in that moment, but that imbalance was already planting a question in her that I wouldn't be able to answer for weeks. Our father never did anything without a reason. If I'd gotten the estate and she'd gotten a mystery, there had to be a reason for that too, and I could see it on her face. Even then, she was starting to wonder if I already knew what that reason was. Richard slid the brass key across the table. A small, faded tag hung from it, 3 words written in my father's handwriting. Open it alone. Evelyn picked it up slowly. Underneath it was a second envelope. Richard explained our father had told him not to hand it over until the first letter had been fully read. Inside was a single page, addressed only to her. He apologized in advance for the pain his final wishes would cause. He warned her that what she'd find in that box would make him look like a very different man than the father she remembered. He begged her not to stop searching after the first answer, because the truth, he wrote, only revealed itself at the very end. Then came a line neither of us understood yet. He wrote that if either of us reached a conclusion too quickly, we would spend the rest of our lives blaming the wrong person. That warning wouldn't make sense to me until the very end of this story. Neither of us said a word on the drive to Hartford National Bank. I followed her car through the wet afternoon traffic, hoping every red light would give us a chance to talk. It never did. Every mile just seemed to put more distance between us. Somewhere around the 3rd or 4th intersection, I found myself thinking about a night years earlier, not long after we lost our mother. Evelyn had walked into a room and found our father and me talking in low voices. We stopped the second we saw her. At the time, I told myself we were protecting her from more grief than she could carry. I never once considered that the moment would stay with her. I didn't know until much later that she never forgot it. That somewhere in the years since, that one memory had quietly turned into evidence, just waiting for a reason to matter. By the time we pulled into that parking lot, I think she'd already started rewriting everything she thought she knew about me. The bank manager seemed to already know why we were there. He confirmed Evelyn's identification, and offered his condolences, then explained our father had arranged everything himself, years earlier. When I tried to follow her into the vault, he politely stopped me. Only the name on the bank's records was allowed inside. I told him we were family, that we had just buried the man who rented that box. He apologized, but he wouldn't bend. My father's instructions had been specific. Evelyn would go in alone. I stood in that lobby, and watched the heavy steel door close behind her, and for the first time in decades, I felt completely powerless. I had spent most of my life trying to protect my sister, solving problems before they ever reached her, carrying more than my share without complaint. And now there was nothing I could do but wait, and hope that whatever was inside box 317 wasn't about to take the only family I had left. Everything I'm about to tell you about what happened inside that vault, I only know because my sister told me herself, later that same day, and because I read our father's own words with my own eyes not long after. She told me the manager led her straight to the box marked 317, then stepped back and left her alone with the second key. She said she took one breath before she turned it. The lock clicked open, and inside wasn't money or jewelry. It was a weathered leather journal, several envelopes, numbered in order, stacks of old receipts tied with twine, photographs in protective sleeves, newspaper clippings. a small wooden box that looked like it hadn't been touched in years. On top of everything sat one more note in our father's handwriting. Just one sentence. If your first thought is that I betrayed your mother, then I have already failed to tell my story the way it deserves to be told. She told me her heart started racing the moment she read it. She reached for the first photograph, and the second she turned it over, everything she thought she understood about our father became so much harder to explain. I need to stop here and tell you something I have never said out loud to anyone outside that building. Something I buried for 30 years, the way you bury the parts of yourself you're most afraid other people will use against you. The photograph my sister found was of a 16-year-old girl standing on the porch of our childhood home, one hand resting over a rounded stomach, her face turned just slightly from the camera, like she couldn't bear to be looked at straight on. That girl was me. On the back, in my father's handwriting, was a date. A date that fell only 3 months after we buried our mother. I was 17 when I went to my father with a secret I'd been carrying alone for months, terrified it would be the thing that finally destroyed what was left of our family. I expected him to be ashamed of me. Instead, he saw a grieving girl who needed her father more than she had ever needed anyone in her life. Together, quietly, we arranged a closed adoption through a family in Providence he vetted himself. People who wanted a child more than anything, and could give him a home I couldn't. I went back to school that fall like nothing had happened. Nobody outside that room ever knew. Not even Evelyn.
My father made me one promise before we sealed that arrangement. He said he would never let that boy go without, and that I would never have to explain myself to anyone, including my own sister. I believed, for 30 years, that the promise ended there. I had no idea he'd spent every year since quietly keeping it. What my sister found inside that vault wasn't evidence of an affair. It was proof of everything my father did after that day. All of it hidden from me too. The receipts weren't payments to another woman. They were tuition invoices from a small private school in Providence. Travel fees for a wrestling team. A used truck bought for a boy's first job. A semester of nursing school. The photographs weren't of a secret family. They were school pictures. A boy in a football uniform. The same boy, years later, standing outside a hospital in a white coat, sent to my father quietly, year after year, by the people raising him, who apparently thanked him in writing every single year for a kindness they never fully understood the reason for. The newspaper clipping was recent. A local feature on new nurses at Hartford General. A young man named Michael Doyle, smiling in his scrubs. 30 years old, kind-eyed, mine. The last thing in that box was a small wooden case holding a single hospital identification bracelet, tiny and yellowed with age. On it, someone had written 2 words, Baby Whitmore. My sister read our father's last page twice before she could stand. He hadn't been hiding a betrayal. He'd been guarding my secret so completely that even loving me fully meant never once letting me see what it cost him to keep it. He left her the key, he wrote, because she was the daughter who had always needed proof before she could believe anything, and he needed her to see the truth with her own eyes before either of us was allowed to decide what happened next. He left me the house and the business because he never wanted me to feel, again, the way I'd felt at 17, like I couldn't provide for myself, like I had nothing left to stand on. It had never been about who he trusted less. It had been about what each of us needed to finally be free. When Evelyn walked back into that lobby, I stood up so fast the folder in my lap hit the floor. She didn't ask me anything. She just looked at me, and I braced myself for whatever she'd decided in that room. He didn't betray Mom, she said quietly. He kept a promise to you. I don't think I understood the sentence at first. Then she put the photograph in my hands. That girl on the porch, the hospital bracelet resting beside it, and something in me that had been holding perfectly still for 30 years finally broke. We sat in my car in that parking lot for almost an hour, doors closed against the rain, while she read our father's journal to me from the beginning. I cried the way you cry when a wound you've learned to live around is finally allowed to close. I told her things I had never told another living person. How I used to drive past the Providence exit sometimes, never taking it, just needing to know it was still there. How I'd made myself stop wondering, because wondering hurt too much to survive twice. It was Evelyn who found him, 3 weeks later, through the hospital directory. She asked him, gently, if he'd ever wondered about the family who quietly paid for his truck and his tuition, and never once asked for anything back. He had. We met him in Richard's office, of all places, the same table where I'd first heard our father's confession. Michael brought a photo album of his own. I brought every version of an apology I'd rehearsed in the car, and I didn't need a single one of them, because the moment he walked in, he just said, I always figured somebody out there loved me enough to stay invisible. I just never thought I'd get to thank her. I understand now that my father didn't spend 30 years hiding a second family. He spent 30 years quietly holding 2 families together, so that neither of his daughters would ever have to carry more than we could survive. One debt paid in silence. One truth saved for exactly the moment we would need each other most. Evelyn and I still visit his grave together every year, on the anniversary. We bring someone new with us now. Michael leaves flowers, always the same kind his adoptive mother once told him my father sent every spring, without ever signing his name. Some days I still catch Evelyn studying me a little too carefully, like she's checking whether I'm still holding something back. I don't blame her for it. 30 years of not knowing doesn't undo itself in one afternoon in a parking lot, no matter how much I wish it did. I just haven't figured out how to make that feeling fully go away, for either of us. I used to think the hardest thing I'd ever have to do was keep that secret. I know now the hardest thing was learning to trust my sister with it, and finding out, after everything, that she loved me more for finally telling her the truth than she ever could have for keeping it from her. There's still one name in this story I've never said out loud. Not to Evelyn, not to Michael, not even here. Someday I might be ready to tell that part too. Today just isn't that day. If this story meant something to you, let me know where you're watching from, and if you want to hear more stories like mine, stay close. I promise you, this won't be the last truth I'm ready to tell.